Alright, so our patient today is the Salient Arms Gray from EMG, and we are going to go ahead and tear this down and get it ready for installation. Alright, so everything's disassembled. We got the gearbox out here. All we're going to do at this point is disassemble the gearbox as per usual and get rid of everything inside. Alright, so got everything out. Everything we don't need has been put away. You see we still have the trigger and the trigger spring. We also still have the selector plate and the safety arm here. Other than that, everything has been set aside. If you want at this point, you can go ahead and wipe some of the grease out of the gearbox if there's a lot. Doesn't really hurt anything. Generally cleans up the installation, so we'll go ahead and do that. For that, we're just going to use a rag with a little bit of acetone on it. Not worried about getting every last bit, but just get the majority of it out of there so it doesn't gunk anything up, make it greasy. One step we do on all of our installations usually is not necessary, but we do it just to make sure, is if you have a selector plate here that doesn't have the metal sleeve on it, we go ahead and just chamfer that inside edge a little bit that engages the selector switch a little bit. You can see I don't even have to remove it from the gearbox. All I'm doing is breaking that sharp edge. So before we go ahead and install everything, I want to talk about one thing we do that is not absolutely required, but we do it on just about all of our builds, and that is put in alignment screws. So I'm going to go ahead and put a couple screws back in the body here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put in set screws on the sides of the gearbox that will sit in between the gearbox and the lower receiver here. So with the alignment screws, the first thing you want to do is locate where you want them on the gearbox. We are going to put them on these two raised surfaces inside the receiver here, sort of on the front side of that. You can see we have used a center punch to punch a hole, or a starting mark, in the gearbox. The one thing I will say with that is you have to be careful drilling through here. It's easy to come through on a corner or an edge on the inside, and that, if you're not careful, can break your drill bit. So you want to be real careful. You want to try to drill through to a spot that is flat on the inside surface as well. For instance, this hole here, if I look inside, that's going to come through right on the bottom flange of the gearbox. So I'm going to move it up just a hair. Right, like that, and that should give me enough clearance that I don't come through. So we use 632 set screws for this. I have a 7/64 drill bit that I'm going to use to drill the hole, and then we'll tap it. One. Flip it over and do the other side. Alright, so we got our two holes drilled. We're going to take our 632 tap, and we're going to tap those holes. So now we can take our set screws, and they'll thread in just fine. And you can see that the set screws are basically right across from each other. I just eyeballed this. I didn't try to drill it all as one hole. We find that trying to drill it all as one hole tends to break your drill bit if you're not careful. They're pretty much right across from each other, which is what we want, so that they're pushing straight across at each other and not twisting the gearbox by pushing here and here. There we go. That's how we do our alignment screws. Alright, now as far as setting the alignment screws, what we're going to do is, to start out with, we are just going to do it visually and basically set them so that they are the same length on each side, so that they're fitting snugly in between the receiver there. Later on, we're going to go ahead and actually check the alignment once the unit is installed and make sure it's set up perfectly, and then we'll Loctite those screws in place, get them all locked down so they don't move. Let's go ahead and take this back out and go ahead and put the system in the gearbox. Alright, so we'll be doing the Spartan edition here, so we're going to go ahead and put the electronics in. We'll note that we did remove this small stud that sits right here. It's the trigger spring stud. We did remove that on this gearbox. We found that it made the the board sit in a better position. Most of the time that's not really necessary. Often it's just part of the gearbox, but we found the way the holes lined up on this gearbox, it let it sit in a better position if we removed that. Small flathead screwdriver will take that right out. We're going to run our wiring down here, and there's two options basically. One is to do this and to run it through the center here. In some ways that's the easiest option, because then you can just run your wiring right through the center of the grip. If you are running your wiring, alternatively you can run your wiring right here, like the stock wiring. However, if you do that, you can't just run the wiring through the center of the grip, because this section here will pinch the wiring up against the gearbox once you tighten it down. So if you want to run it like this, then you'll need to take a Dremel or something and open up the slot between those two so you can run the fitting through there and then slide it over so it goes through that hole and doesn't get pinched. We're just going to run it through the middle. So for this installation, we're going to be using the Gen 2 Inferno. We will be using the Wolverine Airsoft filtered grip line. Let's go ahead and get that installed. So now we can plug it into the electronics, put it into the gearbox, and the airline in this case is just going to run out right the same way that the wire harness does. So now we're going to install the buffer tube adapter. We're going to take the buffer tube screw, thread it in there, set that in place, right like so. Put our trigger back in, put the gearbox back together. Now we just reinstall all our screws. Always make sure that your wiring is not pinched. So before we fully tighten this down, I'm going to put one in up towards the front where there's not really any wiring, and I'm just going to put it in loosely to hold everything together. Then I'm going to check and make sure that no wiring is being pinched, that everything is free and clear there. Go ahead and snug everything back down. One trick we'll mention here is some gearboxes, just due to variation in the manufacturers, the buffer tube adapter stays in place more securely than others. The GMPs, it tends to stay in pretty well, but if you find that it just wants to fall out of place a lot, you can take, say, a small piece of foam, or we've even seen people use packing peanuts. It sounds silly, but if it works, it's not really silly. And stick it in between the back of the solenoid here and the buffer tube adapter there, just to hold it in place there in the gearbox so it doesn't move around. This gun, it's not really necessary, but you might find it helpful on some gun you're working on. Alright, so we got everything installed in the gearbox here. We got our alignment set screws installed and roughly adjusted. At this point, we would go ahead and test the electronics. Alright, that's good. And we can plug it into air, pressure check it, make sure that everything's functioning normally. Always a good idea before you put everything back in the gun. If you hadn't done anything with the alignment screws, you'd go ahead and reassemble it normally. At this point, what we're going to do is we're going to go through the alignment process and show you how to do that more precisely to make sure everything's locked down. So we're going to go ahead and install the gearbox back in the lower receiver, and we're going to go ahead and put our two pins through. Again, checking the wiring. You may be able to see here, if I just pressed here, my wiring is going to get caught by the pin, so we don't want to do that. We want to push the wiring out of the way and let the pin pass through. On some gearboxes, you can use the wire guide to keep the wiring out of the way. The GMP gearboxes, the wiring guide doesn't work for that application, so we just have to watch out for it. I'm going to go ahead and put my front alignment pin in. So we have it in our lower receiver, and if there's a lot of play in it still, you might have to put the grip on as well to pull things together. In this case, there's not a lot of play with those alignment screws and the two pins at the back. Things are pretty solid. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take the barrel and hop up out of our upper receiver. We are going to assemble this onto the lower receiver without any barrel and hop up, just like so. Now we're going to use another barrel, and we're going to slide it down from the far end, from the muzzle end of the barrel, and we're going to check our alignment. As you can see, the alignment's pretty close. It probably would be okay. But you see the barrel is sitting a little more towards the left side of the gun than the nozzle is. So we're going to go back in and use those alignment screws to straighten that up and get that just perfect. So we're going to pull it out, and what we're going to do is we want the nozzle to move towards the left side of the receiver. I am going to tighten the screw down by a half turn, and then I'm going to back the other side out by a half turn as well. Do it just right by the same amount. You still should be snug. There we go. Got it snug back up. There's no play. Now we're going to put it back together and see how we did. Alright, so after our adjustment, we got it back together. And now when we check, barrel lines up perfectly with the nozzle. And we're going to, one last time, pop the receiver off. And I'm going to put a little dab of Loctite on those 2 adjustment screws. Now, if this was a vibration-heavy application, we'd want to put the Loctite on ahead of time so it really got worked down into the threads. As it is, all we want to do is just keep it from moving during normal use. So we don't generally bother taking it all the way back out. Just put a dab on the outside. It will sort of wick down into the threads enough that it won't really budge during normal use, and that way we don't have to worry about getting the threads right back in the same position after we take them back out. Now we're all ready to go. We're just going to go ahead and put her back together. With the grip installed, we can go ahead and check now that our selector states are working correctly, which they are. So now that we got the grip put back on, the buffer tube put back on, we're just going to do one final check that we're still lined up, which it looks good. Check out our more focused alignment video as far as how the buffer tube and grip work together to sometimes affect the alignment. But in this case, we just tightened the grip down, then put the buffer tube on, and we're all set there. So pop it back off. One last time. Put our shiny new mock bolt in there. Slide it all back together. We should be good. We'll grab some air and test it out. Alright, we are good to go. So that was the installation process, beginning to end. I hope that was helpful, showing how all the different steps work together and sort of the process that we go through to make sure we get things together just right every time. So drop us a comment. Be sure to give us a follow for lots more informational videos as well as product announcements and other good stuff from Wolverine Airsoft.